So I'm repeating this welcome to everyone, but also this being the first attempt at this sort of a special Zoom occasion, I also want to acknowledge that this is being produced on Wadawurrung land locally, and also acknowledge the fact that the Wadawurrung are the traditional owners of this part of Victoria, and also pay my respects on behalf of everyone to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And while I have a chance, Victoria is not only the moderator, but she's actually, going to be carrying the load of the technical production for this. So it's a big experiment for us, but a very, very special welcome, a warm welcome to Liz Monument. Now, some of us will have checked out her website, where she is promoted as a novelist, a script doctor, hey, as well as a writing coach. A warm welcome to you, Liz. We've had a little bit of a chat. Now, it's really heartening to find people such as Liz in our own backyard, so to speak, here in the wider Geelong area. So to kick this off, Liz, how does a former music teacher from England come to be a writer, a novelist, a script doctor, and a writing coach right here in Geelong? Let's take this journey. Off you go, Liz.
Well, like all writers, I've always written since childhood, and I'd always sort of dreamed of being able to do something more serious with it and become mainstream published. So I wrote as a hobby in the background and taught music because that was, what I'd studied at college and what I'd enjoyed. But it's actually been really, really useful for me because all that teaching experience, and halfway through I specialised in adult ed, which is great because the people I end up working with now as a coach, as a writing coach, tend to be obviously mature writers. So I was really glad that I'd got that sort of background experience to draw on. But as for coming to Geelong, we decided a few years ago that we wanted to emigrate, but we were against the clock because I believe we only got additional points up to 45. And then when we actually left the UK, we were in our late 40s. So we were quite lucky to get in 2017. And I kind of wanted to swap to becoming a full-time writer and editor at that point, but in reality, two careers like that, two jobs, I ended up working both for about 4 or 5 years, but I'm glad to say now I'm finally a full-time writer and editor.
That's fantastic. Now we, of course, eagerly hoping to learn how to get on this this gig ourselves. Now you say you've been writing since childhood. You've clearly also entered in various competitions. Can you perhaps, and there'll be many of the members who've done this here too, who as not exactly professional writers, but writers have entered many competitions. So perhaps from your own experience, what are some of the pieces of good advice that you can pass on to us when we're engaged in, entering writing competitions?
I think the thing is everybody's got to start somewhere, and when you do start entering competitions, it's generally because you're not a published writer and you want to know whether you can reach that standard, whether people will actually enjoy reading your fiction. And years ago when I was entering comps, because I'm in my early 50s now, so as a lot of you will appreciate, it was a different world. There was no international writing, there was no internet. Years ago, if you entered a national competition in the UK, for example, and I imagine it would have been the same in Australia, if you won or were placed, that was it, you were out. You could never ever enter another national short story writing competition, full stop. The world's so much different now. So I think it's great for people to be able to take advantage of the fact that you're allowed to enter competitions internationally. Everything from flash fiction, from really short flash fiction of a few lines, to short stories, to first chapters of a novel. And in fact, I believe there are some websites that you can actually find on search engines that detail every single competition that's open to you. So the important thing is just to go for it. If you're not confident with something long, then go for something really short. And you know, there's so much out there. There are so many self-help websites and blogs and forums out there today that you just didn't get all those years ago. So just dive in and make use of them, I would say.
Terrific, great. And we do Geelong Writers does promote the various competitions that are, you know, provide opportunities for our members. Now, one of the things I've observed as we get submissions in for our anthology, it's very clear that anyone seeking to enter a competition really needs to be guided very clearly by the guidelines. You know, it's no good if I'm particularly interested in a genre, but I missed the mark because I haven't read that this is all, you know, they're welcoming horror stories, and I've come up with something that is more like science fiction without the horror. So it's clearly important to read those guidelines, even down to the very basic points about the numbers of words that that they're looking for, the adjudicators are looking for, you know. So it's no good writing 5,000 words if all they're asking for is 1,500.
That's right. And the same thing applies to submitting to agents, because every literary agent has different rules, and you've got to be so careful, because if you break the rules, some have systems where you can actually submit sample chapters within their system rather than sending them as email Word attachments. Some don't represent science fiction. Some won't touch horror with a barge pole. Some have really specific word counts that you've got to adhere to. So it's competitions as well as agents, and the same thing applies across the board. As long as you're really careful about reading the instructions, because otherwise you work quite often that they're so hit with so many entries and so many submissions, they'll quite often just delete it and you'll never hear back, and they won't read it either. So yeah, it's always worth checking out the individual spec for how you're supposed to submit and what exactly they'll take.
Now, all right, so we steer clear of the genres that we're not comfortable with. And Liz, what are your particular genres that you are most comfortable with?
Science fiction, fantasy, and historical, strangely enough. They're at opposite ends of the spectrum, but in actual fact, you've got to do the same thing when you write them, because you're not writing about the regular everyday world. It's either distant past, so you've got to imagine bits of it, or distant future, so you have to do exactly the same. So I've always found that writing at opposite ends of the scale, right back in Anglo-Saxon times or 3,000 years into the future, they're actually pretty similar, because a lot of it's guesswork and making it up.
Now, Liz, can you get away with guesswork when you're looking at the historical fiction?
Not so much, but just
No.
for example, there's a certain amount of guesswork in there. For example, I was writing a piece for my third novel, which is unpublished. It was for PhD. It's more experimental than commercial, so it'll probably need a lot of work to actually bring it up to publishable standard. But one of the things I was looking at was Anglo-Saxon building, and I used to watch Time Team, and I've watched specific documentaries that have been made about things that have been discovered in Anglo-Saxon times, including the post holes and the full sort of excavation of these sites that had these Anglo-Saxon buildings on. But what people didn't know is what they were used for. So they can reconstruct from what we can find and say what they look like with the slanted roofs and the post holes all around and so on the short walls. But what they can't do is say, were they used to live in? Were they used for food storage? Were they used for storage of anything else? So in that sense, you have to make it up, because although you've got some kind of a framework there for certain facts, there are bits that we just don't know, and you do have to make that up. You have to think on your feet, and that's pretty much the same as writing science fiction, where you're just taking an idea and trying to sort of shove it off into the future and imagine what's going to happen.
Staying with the history aspect, it's fine when we're talking about material things, you know, buildings, structures, whatever. What about development of character?
I always like to think that characters basically are pretty much the same then as they are now. You'll get people who are fine, upstanding members of society, and you'll get people who are just a teensy bit criminal. So I think one of the things that you can do to bring historical fiction alive is not to feel that you've got to write them as though they were somehow different. Write them as though they're the same, just in old clothes, in old-fashioned clothes and in an old-fashioned environment. And one of the things that can really help that is not to feel that you've got to write almost a kind of pidgin English based on a romantic idea of how you think they would have spoken. Using plain speech, ordinary speech for historical characters is great, and it's actually more of a modern take on it than trying to sound very lyrical.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Now, this attempt you're doing here with the material that's from your PhD, where you're actually, you as an editor and as a script doctor, who do you go to bring this together? This is quite an interesting attempt, where you're breaking a genre mold, in fact, several, you know, in the one combined attempt. Who is your source of wisdom and advice?
Well, I have a few. I had one editor who I worked with for 6-7 years on and off for the PhD. I had another editor I worked with for my master's who I would trust with anything. I can still, you know, ask her questions now. But lately, I've asked a friend of mine who's a novelist to edit my work. And, you know, I trust her so much that she can literally just scroll across something, this is dreadful, it won't work. And I'm fine with that because I've got that trusting relationship with her. But the thing is, the main thing to consider is that all writers still need editors, and even the very best of the best bestsellers will still have their regular editors, because none of us can stand outside the box as easily as somebody else can.
Yeah, thanks. Now, I noticed earlier you mentioned some other writers who were breaking the mold, so to speak. Doris Lessing, was that? Yes. Now,
yeah.
That brings me to the question, who are the writers that you love to read and who may be influencing your writing and your style? Obviously, she's one of them.
Yeah.
Yep.
As well as Doris Lessing, I don't like everything she's written, but I really like her dystopian novels because she's very, very inventive. I've heard her referred to as quite an undersold novelist. I think there are a lot of people around who think that she should have done much better and been far better promoted, but I think she's a brilliant writer anyway. And then there's David Mitchell, because he tends to write in short novellas put end on end. Well, they're not that short, they're probably about 25,000 words. So his novels are made up of stories put, different novellas put end on end and linked. And they're terrific because he'll go right from a historical period like 1799 in Japan forward 2,000-3,000 years to a dystopian landscape, and he's one of the few writers who does that. So that's always influenced me because it let me see that it is possible to put all these things next to each other and to actually have the story work.
Fantastic, good. Now, I did notice you also think highly of the work of Winterson, for example, and Atwood. Yes. As well as Lessing, yeah, and Tchaikovsky. Now, I haven't read much of him, but I love his music.
I believe he is a relative. I believe that Tchaikovsky is a relative of the composer, a distant relative. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But he's fantastic because I think he's actually won a couple of Arthur C. Clarke's quite recently. But for science fiction, he is brilliant. But I do try and steer away from reading all of an author's output because I start to try and copy them. And it's something that I advise clients to do as well. Don't get lost in a series, never reread them too frequently, and try to move between authors rather than reading all of an author's output at once, because you will start to try and sound like them.
And And what is your advice when people go down those tracks? You know, why are you avoiding sounding like some of the authors that you really love?
I think there's a few reasons. Firstly, agents and publishers are always looking for new voices. That is something that they do say. So I would always advise clients never to base work on old bestsellers. So Tolkien won't be done again. The Hunger Games won't be done again. So yeah, I think it's a good idea never to get too much into trying to recreate a voice. But the other thing is, it's so difficult to do. It's very, very rarely that somebody can sound like their favourite author. So it sometimes comes across as a poor imitation rather than a, you know, and we all do it, you know, I'm guilty as well. So it's best to try and forge your own way, get your own individual voice and your own style.
Great, thank you for that advice. Now, unlike many of us, you know, there are people in the group who, you know, who have a writing background in terms of at least having done an undergraduate degree and so on. But you seem to have taken it to quite a level, right to the PhD. Now, that's given you the opportunity also to begin to work and assist with publishing houses. And how did that experience, both the academic plus that practical side, how did that help you to polish yourself, or, you know, to develop as a writer?
I think the first thing is the MA and PhD is only one route, and if there'd been other angles available to me back 10 years ago when I first started to look for creative writing tuition, I would have probably done a Faber Academy course or booked a one-to-one coach like I am. The opportunities just weren't there 10 years ago, so the only choice that I had to get into this and have regular feedback and regular editorial critique was to do a master's and then a PhD. So I'll never regret doing it, because obviously it's furnished me with the skills that I need to do the editorial job that I do, but it's not the route for everybody, I would say that. And, you know, it's also very expensive, because if you have to pay your own fees all the way through, you know, what's basically amounts to
Yes.
7-8 years of tuition that I've taken over 10 years, it's not a cheap option. But one of the things that it's enabled me to do that I am really grateful for is, over such a long time studying part-time, part of both courses was to take, to swap extracts, chapters with other people on the course. And so we all got used to editing each other's work. There were lots of editors in there, we were put in groups, and pretty soon you learn how to accept criticism and also who to trust and when to take notice of somebody saying, oh, do you know, I wasn't right keen on that. Because the thing is, if one person doesn't like it, it's quite likely that a few won't like it. So you've got to sort of, you know, listen and adapt what you've written. The more you do it, the easier it gets. So I had years and years of doing this. So when I did my first audition as a sub-editor, I was drawing on all that experience, and that helped me to actually land some work straight away. Because if I hadn't started to sub-edit, I would still be just getting the odd job in through my website, whereas because I went out as a sub-editor and then got a recommendation to HarperCollins by word of mouth, it's been great because it's enabled me to just keep working.
Well, that sounds good. And then, of course, Liz, there's life that also plays a big role. You have a family. You know, what sort of, do you have a particular regime? Do you have a pattern to your day? You know, obviously when you're required to assist someone, you know, you put a bit of time in that. So what do you do during your day that gives you the time on your personal work? How do you break up your day and your week?
It's whatever's thrown at me. So the priority is sort of getting the kids off to school or getting them sorted out with the homeschooling, whatever we're doing that day or that week. And then I'll come back and work. And I can work mobile, I can work anywhere. So when it comes to taking the kids out to hobbies at night, I have a car charger for the laptop and a table that fits onto the steering wheel. So it's really grabbing every hour that I can, because there are so many distractions and school runs and hobbies and family meals and so on and so forth, that I literally work around all that. And I'm very lucky that I can, because I can work remotely. So for example, this morning, I had a client, a regular tuition client. They send me stuff when they're ready. I don't have any control over it. They don't have set submission dates or times, and neither are they told how much they need to submit. So sometimes I can find myself looking at half a novel, and other times it might just be 3 pages. So the rule that I have is to try and get onto it as soon as possible, within 3 days. So today, when my client Roya from the UK, when her 7 pages of a manuscript came in, I actually managed to do that this afternoon, fit it straight in, and then it's returned and sent straight back to the client. Because I think if you have a busy queue and you let it build up, that can be every editor's nightmare. You can't do anything about it when it's full-length novels and long jobs like a line edit or a developmental edit, where you'll be writing at least 1 comment on every page of the manuscript. That is a long job, but I always try and fit the shorter jobs in between so that I don't get too much of a backlog.
Well, the picture you've just given us makes us, I'm sure all of us, more appreciate than we did before the fact that you found the time to come on tonight, which is really, it's great. Do you have any kind of rituals that you go, now this is aside from those external work requirements, when you've got your time to do your writing, are there any particular rituals that you follow? I call them rituals, but you know, mine's basically avoidance. I start noticing cobwebs that I haven't noticed before, you know, that kind of thing. Yes.
I'm glad it's not just me, because yeah, I do that as well, and you have to be so focused and just try and stop. But one of the really useful sort of things that I developed when the kids was younger was to be able to work in any amount of children screaming, playground noise, you know, because sometimes you've just got to, if you take your laptop out to one of the play warehouses, you have to just be able to carry on. So now I don't really have a ritual so much, because I'm used to either working in the car, or when we were allowed in gymnastics, I'd work in the gallery or the kitchen. I'd take the laptop anywhere I was allowed, or I work at the kitchen table, I work at a desk in the living room. But the only thing I do is I like nice notebooks and nice ink pens. So I've got a whole ritual around writing longhand in these books with various inks, and making a real ritual of that. And then when I'm ready to write a draft of a chapter or an experimental scene, that's when I come to the laptop. But I've heard that quite a few writers do that, because apparently David Mitchell has moleskin notebooks. I don't know whether the real moleskin or whether the brown velvet, but apparently he is similarly addicted to those, and that's part of his ritual.
Yes. I'm sure many of us have, you know, our own quaint little rituals, like, you know, preferring to write with a pencil, and it has to be a Faber-Castell 4B, and it has to be on a particular paper. Well, thank you for that. Look, what would be some of the main tips that you would offer? And I know we can get to your website and we can book in for your precious time. But a couple of tips, maybe 3 main tips for beginning writers.
Right, well, this was a lot harder for me than I thought, and I've actually written them down here, all 3 of them, because when you actually start to think about how on earth do I reduce you know, everything that a writer can think about to 3 tips, it is quite difficult. But one of the most valuable that I've written down is to learn to read as a writer, and I've written a website blog about this that is on my blog page. I didn't know what this is until I started MA, and my tutor, who was a poet, she is now a novelist, but then she was a poet, she actually told me to start reading as a writer, and it took me about 2 years to really master. And it's where, instead of just reading a novel for the story, you pick a favourite scene or a favourite character, and you actually dig underneath the prose to find out how the writer made that work. Short, punchy sentences, long lyrical sentences. Whereabouts in the novel is it? What about the language that's used makes it so attractive to you and makes that really work for you? Because the theory is, if you can find out how another writer did it, you can then internalize that and use it in your own writing. So the first one is reading as a writer. The second one, and this is one that I encounter a lot in clients writing all different genres, is to read up-to-date fiction, because nobody's going to sign a novel that's based on an old bestseller, even if it's still a bestseller. So Tolkien, Game of Thrones, you know, that they're out, just put them down, move aside, read them if they, you know, you really enjoy them, but then put them aside. Connect with some up-to-date fiction, really up-to-date fiction, as in written in the past 5 years, because it's only looking at mainstream best-selling fiction written in the past few years and published by the big publishers who were the big five and who are now the big four. It's only when you do that that you realise what's gone out of fashion. For example, a great example would be Fleming's Bond. If you pick up Bond, and after all, the guy's a bestseller, he's still a bestseller today, the Bond franchise is worth billions, so you would think that you can write another Bond with a modern twist and use these books to influence the way you do this, and that'd be great. But it isn't, because if you pick up the books, they've got huge, great long tracts of oration in them, which have gone completely out of fashion with the reduced attention span of today's reader. So that's why it's so important to look at what's happening now in fiction. Read up-to-date fiction, which will help you. Make sure you've got the genre right. So if you want to write dystopian YA, read up-to-date dystopian YA as well as the old dystopian YA. That'll help you. And the final one, and this is one that every writing coach seems to say, write lots, write some more, but be open to making changes when you get feedback.
And that last point is very difficult, being open to making changes. We invest so much of ourselves in things, and many of us don't take too kindly to constructive criticism. Yeah, that's really a big barrier for many people. All right, look, I'm going to bring this element of the session to a close, because I'm sure we're going to have quite a few questions, and the two of us, having had this discussion, will hopefully bring up some more tangential matters. Okay?
Yeah.
Liz, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kent.
Okay. Over to you, our producer.
Okay, thank you, Liz. That was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I'll kick off and I'll ask a question first. Who are the big four publishers?
Let me see if I can remember this. HarperCollins, Simon & Schuster, Penguin. Now, Penguin merged with Random House and became Random Penguin, or Penguin Random House, or whatever. And the fourth one just escapes me. I should know, but it's just one of those things, it's gone. But if you type into a search engine, who are the big five? Because last time I checked, they hadn't actually updated it. I think that they went from 5 to 4 only about a year ago, and the search engines were still referring to them as the big five. But if you type that into a search engine, it'll bring you up all the names of the publishers. They're household names.
Yeah, and you're doing work for HarperCollins, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Yes.
The Australian HarperCollins, yeah.
Okay. And how did you come to be engaged by them? Because that's a big gig, isn't it?
It was lovely. It was word of mouth recommendation, which was just fantastic. So yeah, I did my first job for them. And when they received it back, they were very happy with it. The author was happy with it. So the that particular editor publisher then forwarded my name and number to her colleagues, and basically that's how it works. So that was lovely, because I've heard a lot about word of mouth recommendation, but in my previous job I'd never really experienced it, so it was great.
Fantastic. We've got a question here from Joe. Hi Liz, what are some of the ways to approach editing your piece of writing?
Oh, right, that's a really good question, Joe. And I've actually written some blogs on this, because there are there's the minutiae of editing, which is the line by line edit or a copy edit. And I've written a blog on that with a worked example, because I think it's really important to be able to illustrate where you would use a strike through and substitute another word, and explain why you would cut a sentence down. I've written another blog on clunky prose, which is just about how, when you've got overloaded sentences with too many things happening, how you would go about cutting them down. And again, it's got a worked example in it. Show don't tell, which is perhaps a bigger one. So we're moving from the minutiae now and we're getting into the bigger things. Again, I've written a blog on that with, it's a brief example, but there are a lot of other articles on the internet about that that are worth looking at. And then finally, the biggest one of all is probably genre, and making sure that when you're writing, you know which genres you're combining, and you're doing it in a way that works and so that they don't pull against each other. I've had some clients who've tried to combine romance with spy thriller, but haven't quite done it edgily enough to pull it off. So the romance scenes were overtaking the thriller scenes and deadening the thriller aspect. So it's something worth considering, weighing up. All these things come into editing.
Fantastic. Now, I'd invite you, invite everybody, if they would like to talk to Liz and perhaps ask a question, make a comment. Can you raise your hand? I'm waiting.
Matthew.
Oh, Matthew.
Matthew.
Matthew, you can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Liz.
Hi, Matthew.
So Liz, I was just wondering, I've never even submitted anything. I've never got to that point. And you were talking about the 4 major publishers. I know when I look on the internet, there are so many other publishers, and I guess some are really dodgy. Would you, it seems like a really daunting enterprise, not having even started. Would you recommend just sticking with the well-known publishers and just dealing with rejection?
Okay, well,
Inevitable.
the first thing is, if you want to apply to a mainstream publisher, you have to get an agent first.
Oh, you do?
Yeah. And again, I'm sorry to keep going on about my blogs, but the reason that I've written blogs on this kind of thing is because they're the kind of questions that people ask quite often. So please do check out my blogs, because I do explain this about getting an agent, why it's important, the difference of being finding yourself communicating with a self-publishing rather than a publisher, because some of them are kind of disguised as one thing when they're actually another. But yeah, you would need an agent first and foremost. And yeah, just check out my blogs. And also, I'd like to say, if there's anything that you would like to ask leading on from tonight that doesn't occur to you, I've got a website with a contact form, just use it. So
Thanks.
anything at all you can't find in the blogs, anything that you want to know, just get in touch.
Okay.
I saw another question pop
Yes.
up down here. I can't remember whose name it was, but it was, have I any experience in editing middle grade? Was it somebody called Joe?
Yeah, Joe Taylor.
Can't see a Joe on. I can only see 4 faces on the top. Yes, I do edit middle grade, and it's something I haven't blogged on actually, so I can't send you to the blog to read any advice. But today I've actually finished a report for a client who was trying to work out whether she was pitching at middle grade or YA. So one of the things I've done with the manuscript is I've taken out extracts and I've given her examples of what would be middle grade, what would be YA and why. And we've looked at the difference in tone between these two, because there is a difference in tone, because obviously YA readers can cope with much darker subject matter and so on and so forth. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. There's another question here from Wendy. And Wendy says, I'm currently researching for a book I plan to write, historical fiction, World War I, based on my 2 times great aunt's nursing diaries. Any hints on research?
Oh, goodness. Yeah. The first thing is research, you won't have a problem, because that time period, there are so many sort of depositories of information, even on the internet. Just do some really good internet searches and don't be afraid of looking at academic articles. There's a whole body, it's like an internet library called JSTOR, JSTOR. And if you join JSTOR, you can use their search facility. You can actually join and download, I think it's up to 5 papers at any one time and then start to delete them and download more. It's brilliant. Some of them are easier to read than others because they're academic articles, but you can find all sorts. But what I would also say is when it comes to using family history as, and I have written a blog on this, using family history as the basis for a novel, be aware that when people do that, one thing that they always say is that this novel is based on the story of XYZ, because fiction is a lot more ordered and structured than real life is. So quite often you can take something real like a diary, but you might find that you have to tweak bits of it and make bits of it up to make it fit into a 3-act structure, for example. So don't be afraid of making things up when you're writing real life as historical fiction.
Fantastic.
Yes. Any more out there?
Raise your hand if you've got a question. Raise the hand in the react. Matthew's got another one. You can unmute, Matthew.
Thanks. Sorry, Liz. How would you get an agent?
Agent. Well, basically, this is one of those things where you have to be really careful to read the submission criteria. If you were looking for a UK or a US agent, they're a lot easier to search for on the net than Australian agents. I don't know why. A lot of the Australian agency stuff is not up to date. And I know this because I've had to check it out for clients. There are so many agents not even listed there. Whereas the UK and the US have really got an edge on this. They're bang up to date with everything. So the first thing you do is select agents who are looking for your genre. Check out their individual submission procedures, because they will all ask you for different things, a different way to label the query email with whatever in the title. That can be quite specific. They'll tell you how many words they want. Some of them have an online submission system, which means that you don't send a Word attachment, you send something within their website. So if you check all that out for each individual agent, and then when you are ready to send off, the really important thing to do is to keep a record of them all, because it's so, all writers feel the same. You get so despondent when you get rejection after your rejection. You can actually send out to, I think for my novel that got signed, I sent out to, it must have been 80 agents, 80 if not 100 agents. And the problem is, if you wait, if you apply to 2 or 3 and then you wait the 3 to 6 months to not hear anything from them, your life's standing still, so you can't. So what I did was 10 one weekend, 10 the following weekend, 10 the weekend after, and it takes a long time because they all have individual procedures. But I think by the time I got to 80, I'd already had a bite. So if you keep a record of who you send out to, and another really important thing to do is, agents hate it when you've already been taken on and then they read your manuscript and want to take you on as well. So the best thing you can possibly do is, if somebody takes you on, email the rest of them to let them know you've already been spoken for, because otherwise they'll request your full novel. And I mean, this does take a long time to work up to. I was 44 when I had my debut published, and I'd been writing for many years, and I'd got 3 non-fiction books published years before then. Won a couple of writing competitions. So I'm not saying this because I want to convey that it'll happen overnight, but it's just useful to know.
That's great. No, thank you, Liz. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Another question from Joe. Liz, what are your strategies for dealing with rejections?
You get used to it. A bottle of gin always works well for me. No, you honestly get used to it, and you get to the point where you have so many rejections that you literally you'll be a bit cross for 24 hours and then you'll forget about it. But one thing that I've noticed when it comes to rejection is, you know, you're getting closer to being accepted when firstly you start to get an individual response, and you can tell what's a standard rejection and where they've actually put something about your work in. And the next step up the rejection ladder is when they reply to your manuscript within a week, even to tell you they don't want it. You know by then that there's something in your approach email which made you stand out above the rest, and they've put you to the top of the slush pile. And then, of course, there are others who you never hear from at all. They'll tell you that you'll hear from them in 6 months and you just don't.
I see we've got Vicky here. She probably has a question around, you know, how do I use my time in the box office drinking coffee to kind of energize my writing? Okay.
Well, it's a tough decision. Coffee, writing.
I have a solution for that. Keep a notebook with you at all times. There are novelists like Gilly Cooper who recommend it, the little black book in the handbag. You can always jot notes and write little snippets of dialogue, even drinking coffee.
Very true, Liz. I've started doing that now, and I've got a few notebooks. I just like observing, you know, people when they're talking, some of their mannerisms, something you can pick up on, and just jot it down. You can use it in a story. And I have to apologise. We've got reverberation because Colleen and I live together, so I've not yet mastered the computer enough to stop that. So sorry.
Yeah.
I have a question, Liz. I can't see any other hands. Can you see any other hands up?
I can't see any.
Well, I'll ask. Oh, Linda's got her hand up. I'll ask Linda first. Unmute, Linda.
Liz, I'm very sorry for coming in late. My profuse apologies for that. I'm sorry. So I'm sorry if you've sort of touched on this topic, but I started to read a book this week, and it's really about writing screenplays, which is not my interest, but I'm just curious about the difference. And there was a couple of things that the chap, Rob Hutchison, I think his name is, the first thing he said that really caught my attention was, don't write about what you know, write about who you are. And I'm wondering, is that going to the show and tell, what do you say, don't show, tell? Is that connected, I wonder? And the other thing, I'll put two questions in one. And the other thing he said was that, I think it was Hemingway, forced himself to write 3 hours every day. It would not leave his desk until he had done 3 hours. And then he talked about how tedious that can be and how tiring it can be. And I'm just wondering, do you write 3 hours what you think is rubbish just for the sake of writing for 3 hours to get your mind into that routine?
I certainly have done, and I have lived to regret it. So now I tend to walk away, because what I'd found is that, you know, you can make yourself, and if you're really not in the mood, it can be rubbish. Equally, you can discover one line that's a little gem the next day when you read back over what you've done. So I think it's always worth trying something, but if it's not really happening for you, you can't flog a dead donkey, really. But what you were saying about the screenplay, I think write what you know or write who you are both different ways of saying there is something in you that you are intimately acquainted with that you could use as the basis for a story or a character. So whether that's what you know or who you are. And yeah, it can be a great starting point. I think very daring novelists, I'll actually pick something completely out of their comfort zone, and they'll research and research and research, which is brilliant. But I think certainly when you first start off, you want something that's going to be easier for you to get into paper. You don't want to procrastinate and do 8 months research before you put pen to paper. So yeah, writing about what you know or who you are is a great start. And just out of interest for screenwriting, I took a course recently, an online course, obviously, and it was 5 hours long. Actually, it was a really long one. It was very, very good. Yeah, I found, I'm not a screenwriter and I haven't tried to screenwrite, but I did find it really interesting. I think it's a good idea sometimes just to take courses that are a bit out of your comfort zone. But one of the best pieces of advice about writing a composite novel I had was from a playwright, a professional playwright. And I've been talking to him about a composite. It was my second novel, and I was trying to weave 3 different stories into each other. And I said to this colleague, I don't know where to stop these stories and begin the next. I don't know where I should be intersecting them. And that's the whole nature of this kind of composite that I want to write. And he said, you're doing it all wrong. He said, in playwriting terms, what we do is we write the story we want to write first, and then we think about how to intersect the composites. And that was brilliant, because it's enabled me to advise writers of composite novels who I can see are struggling because they think they need to chip the viewpoints in like this as they go. And I've been able to say to them, thanks to trying this advice out myself in my second novel, don't do that. create 3 separate word files for your different characters, write 3 separate novellas with a proper story arc each, which is the trick really, because that is often where you can go wrong writing a composite, and then decide how you want to intersect them. And that was from playwright. So it's great what you can pick up from other kinds of writer. I saw a question pop up that's disappeared from Matthew.
Yes.
Competitions. I've just written Matthew comps and I can't remember. Have you said?
Are there any short story competitions you would recommend entering?
Oh, they change so often. It depends how much you want to pay in entry fees, because there's things like the Bridport in the UK. I would definitely go for some UK or US comps. But if you want to start with something smaller where the competition will be slightly lower and you've got more of a chance of being published, try magazines, US magazines, UK magazines. Quite often they're free or really low entry. But I remember, I think about 5 or 6, was it 5 or 6 years ago? Was it longer? It might have been longer. I remember thinking that the entry fee for the Bridport Prize for the novel section was pretty extortionate, considering that most of us knew we were going to lose.
I have another question. Liz, any hints on cover letters? Obviously, your cover letters are the things, you know, that the publishers are reading. Do you have any advice on writing those to get noticed?
I always think keep it as brief as possible, because as an editor, I often read draft cover letters. Obviously, I'm not a gatekeeper of an agency, so I don't decide who gets in and who doesn't. But what I have noticed is that there's a certain, if you stick to the basics and you're polite, succinct, to the point, you can't go wrong. It's when authors start to fill the letters with other things that aren't really needed. Because if you think about it, it's a quick sales pitch for an agent or an independent publisher. And I believe that they actually have advice on their website. So it's worth looking. People like Curtis Brown, I believe, have a section, what should be in your cover letter. And you can type it into a search engine and you'll find loads of examples.
Does anybody else?
There was a question from Bud.
Oh, here you go. Furious Fiction by Australian Writers Centre is a good one. First Friday of each month, 500 words. Thank you, Megan.
Brilliant. Yeah, sounds perfect.
I noticed Tom's been pretty relaxed for the evening, hanging back there, retired teacher. I wonder what he's looking for to get his work published. I'm sure he's got enough time now that he's left teaching. That's Tom Adair.
Yes, I do actually. I've got a question. I'm mostly interested in writing poetry. And I'm not too concerned about sort of commercial publishing, but what interests me is that when you're thinking through an idea, to what extent do you develop it visually or in writing? So if you're working on a novel, do you plot it out on paper or is it all in your head?
I think it's a combination of both. I imagine it's the same for any kind of writing, that you know, whether it's poetry, whether it's screenwriting, whether it's there's a lot of creative visualization, I believe they call it, going on, where you're actually seeing this image, and you know, and part of the job of a writer and a poet is any kind of a writer is also to be able to convey that to the reader. So the way that the image is described is really important. Is that what, have I interpreted your question right?
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
Now, Sarah Crawford's been pretty quiet all evening. I'm sure she has some concerns, how to get her work published, whatever.
I am Yeah, I actually have been loving everything that you've been talking about. It's all very new to me. I haven't published anything before, but I've been writing for a really long time. And yeah, I'm writing a book at the moment and then looking at how to get that published, self-publish, or maybe to start with and go from there. And yeah, just accepting the writing that I'm doing that's not amazing, but just keeping going and learning every single time. So yeah, I've learned a lot, Liz, and your website's great and so many resources.
Oh, brilliant. I was just going to say, I know I sound like I'm promoting the website, but seriously, the resources are there for everybody to use for free. So please do, because it's great when I see that I've had some hits on there with people, you know, looking at blogs and so on. So yeah, and as I said before, if there's anything that you as a writer want to see a blog on or want to see included somewhere, send me a message on the contact form and let me know, because I'm always looking to you know, to improve what's on there so that it can just give as much advice and help as possible.
Great, thank you. It's great. Yeah, I may just reach out.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I saw a question pop up and I couldn't write it down fast enough and it disappeared.
Yes, here it is. Any advice for one about to begin on a second draft that's about double the length it should be?
Yeah, that is more common than you'd think, particularly with political thrillers and fantasy travel adventures. I don't know why, you know, but sometimes there's a lot to trim out of a draft. Line edit, show don't tell, will generally reduce your draft by at least 30%, if not 50%. So find out everything you can about show don't tell, including my brief blog, but there's more out there, and the line edit, which I've got an example on the website, a worked example. I can see this one. It stayed up there. Yeah, brilliant. Yes. So Matthew, the simplest way to think about plot is in the 3 acts, because at beginning, middle and ending, Act 1 introduces the characters and their dilemma. Act 2 is where the main protagonist has taken up the challenge and is on an adventure quest related to the dilemma. And this is for absolutely anything. The word adventure quest is very broad, takes in anything. And Act 3 is the finale, where there's a moment where it looks as though things just won't work out, which if you think about it is classic in most novels of any genre. And then things all come together and the hero returns home a changed person, the hero or the heroine. I think that's the best and simplest and clearest, because quite often aspiring debut authors will complicate things. And I can remember my coaches telling me that I did that in my early drafts and my early novels. They were all over the place because it takes so long to write a novel that you mistakenly think you've got to stuff everything into it to keep it exciting. But in reality, you have to actually strip it back. So, yeah.
Can you see that question, Liz? I'm reading. I'll read it to everybody. I'm reading Save the Cat right now. Do you recommend any other books that can help explain the 3 acts? And thank you, Liz. This has been so informative. That's from Megan.
Oh, that's lovely. I'm glad that people are finding it useful. I have a recommended reading list on my website, but to be honest, I haven't got anything that just deals with the 3 acts. But what comes to mind are John York, Into the Woods, because that deals a lot with plot and it's great. It's very accessible. Robert McKee's story is written for screenwriting, but because it deals with story in general, that's another great one. It's a lot thicker though. I think it's about twice as thick as the John York. And other than that, I'd recommend just typing into a search engine, explain the 3 acts, because what you'll notice is that there are slight differences in the way that people express them. So some people will say that the Act 2 has got to be longer. Some people will say, oh, you know, you don't just have a second act in the middle, you can have up to 4 or 5 all squashed in together. There are all sorts of ways of explaining it, but as a general rule of thumb, the 3 acts, go on to any search engine and you'll pull up loads of blogs relating to it.
Thank you so much.
I have another question.
Victoria, yeah, by all means, take it quickly. Are we just
Yes.
about out of time?
No, we've got as much time as we like, but
Oh,
we have
okay.
used
Good.
our hour.
Good.
This is I've been wanting to ask you, Liz. You were a music teacher, a particular instrument or a classroom music teacher?
No, I wasn't classroom, not for the first 10 years. I was peripatetic, which is where you travel to different schools.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I did classical guitar,
Oh, wow.
and subsidiary piano and a little bit of choral work. But yeah, it was actually great because what I found was I'd set myself up as self-employed so that I could find time to write. But it still took me years to find the time to finish a novel. But what I found was that moving around different schools and colleges for that first 10 years, even if you got kids with behavioural problems, you had them one-to-one in a room so they didn't misbehave. So I escaped for 10 years all of that awful classroom harassment that teachers get by teaching guitar and piano. It was great. And then I qualified in adult ed and went into the classroom and worked with teenagers, which was a real eye-opener.
Yes, we know about that, don't we, Gunda?
Who's been quiet? Robin Purdy, she's half asleep. No, you're not. You're looking at the screen, Robin.
I'm wide awake, and I was just about to say thank you, Liz. That's been terrific, but I do have to go and feed my husband.
I wouldn't dream of standing you between you and feeding the husband, so thank you.
I'm sure you have to feed your family too, Liz.
Well, I've actually craftily prepared it over there. It's all ready for them to just microwave when we've finished.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Oh, that's your secret to success. You're multi-talented, obviously, Liz. Yeah.
We have had a most wonderful hour, Liz. Can I just say thank you very much on behalf of everybody. It was brilliant. Your website is brilliant. And I'm so glad we all got to meet you.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it, and I can't wait until we're out of lockdown and I can actually meet some of you guys.
Yes.
The Elephant and Castle.
Yes.
Should
Lovely.
be brilliant. Meanwhile, if there's anything at all you want to know, go on the contact form and I'll receive it as an email.
Thank you, Liz. Over to you, Gunter.
Well, that's it then. This is being drawn to a close now. Again, thank you for our technical production help there, Victoria. And Liz, it's really been lovely. And I'm sure some of us will make it won't be an effort, it will be a pleasure. We will be seeking to catch up with you face to face. Okay.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, everybody.